Mr. President, the Congress and the Senate here have got to make a very fundamental decision, and that is, do we listen to the American people who are hurting today, to seniors who have worked their whole lives but who just cannot get by in what in many cases are meager and inadequate Social Security benefits? Do we listen to them? Do we stand up for and with the people who helped build this country, who worked the farms, who worked in our factories, who served us in the armed forces? Do we stand with them and expand Social Security, or do we listen to those on Wall Street and corporate America who want to cut Social Security benefits and in some cases want to privatize Social Security? This is a huge issue for tens of millions of Americans. And, Mr. President, I intend to do everything that I can not only to resist cuts to Social Security, but to do everything that we can to expand Social Security benefits for those seniors and disabled vets who desperately need that expansion.
Progress, but clearly we still have a long way to go to create an economy that works for all Americans and not just the 1%, not just the billionaire class, and not just wealthy campaign contributors. So, as chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, let me tell you what we are doing right now, as we speak, to create an economy that is fairer and more equitable. We are now working on two major pieces of legislation that, when passed, and they will be passed, will create millions of good-paying jobs and address issues that have been ignored for a very, very long time. Now, the first piece of legislation, I was not deeply involved in it, others were, but the first piece of legislation, which has already passed the Senate, is a bipartisan infrastructure bill that will invest $550 billion in new money to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. Now, I don't know what's going on in Indiana, but I have no reason to believe that it's any different than Vermont and other states where our roads, you're laughing, I guess it is as bad here as elsewhere, huh? But it's bad all over this country in terms of our roads that are crumbling, our bridges, our water systems. You know, one of the things that amazed me is I've gone all over this country. You may not know it, but there are millions of people who, when they turn on the tap in their kitchen, they cannot drink the water. Do you all know that? I mean, it's really quite unbelievable. So you got water systems that need repair. You got our wastewater plants that need repair. We want to expand broadband. You know, a few miles outside of the state capital in Vermont, Montpelier, Vermont, hard to make an internet connection. And that's true all over this country. We're investing in public transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So that bill will do what has been talked about for years. Go back 10 years, 20 years, everybody says, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, everyone says, our infrastructure is crumbling, we gotta do something about it. We didn't. This legislation takes us an important step forward in doing that. Now, that bill, and I wanna get a little political here, that bill was supported, as some of you know, we have a strange situation now in the Congress. In the Senate, where I work, you got 100 members, 50 of them are in the Democratic caucus, 50 of them are in the Republican caucus. We have the majority because of the Vice President of the United States. So you got a 50-50 split in that infrastructure bill. All 50 members of the Democratic caucus voted for it. 19 Republicans voted for it, which means that 30 of them did not. They voted against it. Now, the second bill that I'm going to chat with you about is a bill that I am heavily involved with, and that is a $3.5 trillion piece of legislation, which, in my view, is the most consequential bill for working families in the modern history of this country, probably going back to the New Deal, FDR, and the Great Depression. This bill says loudly and clearly that now is the time for Congress to have the courage to stand up to the powerful, big money special interests that have such enormous power with their lobbyists over the economic and political life of our country. And that now is the time for the U.S. Congress to do what has not been done in a very, very long time, and that is stand with the working families of this country, stand with the children and the younger generation, stand with the elderly and the sick and the poor. And addition to all of that, now is the time for the United States to lead the world against the existential threat of climate change. Now, the good news is that we will pass that bill probably within the next 6 weeks or so. The bad news is that we will not, in all likelihood, get one Republican vote. Not in the Senate, not in the House. And I want you all to remember, just a few years ago, all of these Republicans who today are not prepared to stand for the working families of this country, just a few years ago, voted unanimously or virtually unanimously for massive tax breaks for billionaires and the wealthiest families in America. And now when we're trying to expand health care, they voted and almost succeeded. They lost by one vote, late John McCain, to repeal the Affordable Care Act and throw over 30 million Americans off the health care that they had. And today we cannot get one Republican vote for this legislation. So let me say a few words about what is in this bill, why I'm here this evening, and the context in which we write this bill. I don't have to tell any of you that in the United States today, the gap between the very, very rich and everyone else is wider than it has been in the last 100 years. We're going back to the Gilded Age, where so few people had so much and so many working people, lower income people, had nothing. And in the midst of this trend of the rich becoming richer, while the middle class struggles, we are moving toward an oligarchic form of society. Today, the two richest people in America own more wealth than the bottom 40% of our society. You got that? Two people. And these people have so much money, they really don't know what to do with it, and they're spending it on space trips. That's what they're doing with their money. Today, the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 92%. And since 2009 and the Wall Street crash of that period, 45% of all new income goes to the top 1%. Unbelievably, so we're looking at massive income and wealth inequality. And incredibly, just during this pandemic that we're still in, 700 billionaires in our country have become $1.8 trillion wealthier, while at the same time, thousands of essential workers, the people who work in grocery stores, people who work in hospitals, the people who work as bus drivers, as firemen, as cops, whatever. Thousands of them have died, while the people on top have done phenomenally well. And meanwhile, while the very rich become much richer, working families coast to coast are struggling to put food on the table and to take care of their families. Today in America, over 90 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured. We lose some 60,000 people a year who don't get to the doctor when they should because they can't afford health care and because we pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. Today in America, the wealthiest country on earth, some 600,000 Americans are sleeping out on the street and do not have a place they can call home. And I got to tell you that in Washington, D.C., literally 2 blocks from the Capitol, there is a tent encampment of homeless people. And throughout this country, there are millions and millions of young people who are struggling with outrageous levels of student debt, and there are other young people who would love to get a higher education, but simply cannot afford the cost of tuition. Incredibly, since 1971, we have had, as all of you know, an explosion in technology and an explosion in worker productivity. The average worker today is producing far more than the workers did 50 years ago because of that technology. And yet, in real inflation accounted for dollars, there are many workers in this country today who are not making a nickel more than they did 50 years ago. Now, we need to pass the legislation I'm going to describe to you in a moment, because in the wealthiest nation on earth, it is unacceptable that half of our people live paycheck to paycheck. It is unacceptable that the younger generation has the dubious distinction of being the first generation in modern American history that will likely have a lower standard of living than their parents. So let me tell you briefly what this legislation will accomplish. For a start, we understand that it is absolutely imperative that we end the obscenity of some of the wealthiest people in this country. I'm talking about multi-billionaires who in a given year pay nothing in federal income tax, not a nickel. Can you imagine being one of the wealthiest people in the world, and while working people are paying their taxes, if you are rich and you got a whole lot of accountants and lawyers and you know how to manipulate the system, in some years you pay nothing in federal taxes. We are going to end that obscenity. And we are also going to end the obscenity of dozens of major profitable corporations that make billions a year, that stash their profits in the Cayman Islands and tax havens all over the world. We're going to end the obscenity of some of these corporations not paying a nickel in federal income taxes. Now, my Republican colleagues are busy telling everybody Bernie Sanders and the Democrats are going to raise taxes. You're right. We're going to raise them on the richest people in this country who have to start paying their fair share of taxes. But as President Biden made absolutely clear, under this legislation, no family in America making less than $400,000 a year will pay a nickel more in federal taxes. And in fact, many of those families will be receiving a very significant tax break.